On Thanksgiving night, while my family gathered around a beautifully decorated dinner table, my son-in-law suddenly stuck out his foot and sent me crashing down the staircase. As I curled up on the floor in agony, my daughter crossed her arms and snapped, "Dad, get up." "I know you're fine." My son-in-law smirked. "He's just doing it for sympathy." Then even my wife sighed. "Maybe he'll do anything to ruin a family gathering." But when my youngest son rushed me to the hospital, the nurse who examined me stepped outside, and within the hour, a detective was on the phone. "Thank you for being here. It genuinely matters." Quick question before we begin: where in the world are you right now? Drop your country or city in the comments. I want to know who's listening. A note: this story weaves fictional elements throughout, built for entertainment and reflection. Names and settings are coincidental, but the lesson inside is not. 68 years on this earth, and I have learned one thing above all others: the most dangerous meals are the ones that look the most beautiful. The Pendleton estate sat on 10 acres of Temecula Valley soil out in Riverside County, California, where the hills roll dry and gold from October through March, and the air smells of chaparral and old stone. From the highway, the property looked like something from a magazine: white wood siding, black shutters, a wraparound porch my grandfather built in the summer of 1953. From the inside, if you knew where to look, you could see the cracks. My name is Harlan Pendleton. I am 68 years old. I have lived on this land my entire life. And on the Thursday before I almost lost it forever, I sat at the head of my dining room table and counted the smiles of the people who wanted to take it from me. The date was November 28th, 2024, Thanksgiving Day. My wife, Constance, had set the table 2 hours before anyone arrived. She was 65, a woman who had always moved through a room with the ease of someone who had rehearsed every step in advance. The white linen was pressed flat. The good china was out the set we only used 3 times a year. The chandelier above the table threw warm light across everything, and if you had walked in off the street and seen it, you would have thought, this is a happy family. My daughter Claudia arrived first with her husband Fletcher. Claudia was 40, our older child. She had her mother's cheekbones and a manner of carrying herself that suggested the room owed her something, an inheritance of attitude more than appearance. Fletcher Morrow was 42, a real estate broker out of Riverside County, who had been working our land deal for the better part of 6 months. He wore his confidence the way some men wear cologne, heavy, inescapable, applied before walking into any room, regardless of the occasion. I had never fully trusted Fletcher Morrow. Not from the first handshake 15 years ago. A man who smiles before he has anything to smile about has already decided what he wants and is simply waiting for the room to catch up. My son Reed came in 20 minutes later alone. He was 30 years old, a software engineer who worked mostly from his apartment in town. He had turned down a job offer from a company in Seattle earlier that year. I did not know this yet, not on that evening. Reed was the quiet one. He had been quiet since he was 4 years old, sitting in the dirt beside me while I pruned the lemon trees, watching everything, saying very little. That evening, he took the seat at the far end of the table near the kitchen doorway, almost outside the ring of light from the chandelier. He watched the room the way I had taught him to watch the land, patient, steady, reading what was actually there, rather than what someone wanted you to see. Our old friend Glenn Whitaker arrived at 6 o'clock, the only guest outside the family circle. Glenn was 72, a retired pastor who had known me since we were young men, who had baptized both my children, and who had stood at the graveside when my father died 20 years ago. He brought a bottle of cider and took the chair beside Reed without being asked. There are friendships that do not need instructions, and Glenn Whitaker was that kind of friend. Through the tall windows facing the back garden, I could see Eugene Taft working in the failing light. Eugene was the groundskeeper who had been coming to the property 3 times a week for the past 3 months, hired through a referral I could no longer clearly recall. He was trimming the rose bushes along the garden wall. I noticed it because it made no sense. Those roses did not need trimming in late November. And no groundskeeper I had ever employed worked past sunset on a national holiday. In the far corner of the yard, young Tommy Greer was loading his lawn equipment into the bed of his truck. Tommy was 16, the son of our neighbor, 2 properties over, who mowed our grass each week for $40 and never caused trouble. He paused as he passed. Eugene looked at the older man for a moment, with his head tilted slightly, then kept walking. I saw it through the window. I noted it and put it aside. The meal began. Fletcher set his leather briefcase beside his chair rather than leaving it at the front door the way guests do. A small thing, I noticed. 20 minutes into dinner, he reached into the briefcase and produced a folder thick bound with a paper clip, with the logo of a company called Pacific Meridian Ventures printed across the front. He set it at the edge of the table near the breadbasket, angled toward me and said nothing about it for another 10 minutes. Then just something to look at when you have a moment, Harlan. No pressure tonight. A man who says there is no pressure has already decided on the pressure and the deadline. I did not touch the folder. Constance passed the sweet potatoes. As she did, our eyes met for a fraction of a second, and hers moved away first. In 38 years of marriage, my wife had never been the first to look away from me. I set that fact beside the other facts I had been quietly collecting for several weeks. Several months, if I was willing to be honest with myself. Glenn raised his glass and told the story of my grandfather, Harold, how Harold Pendleton had come home from the Second World War in 1945 with very little money and an absolute certainty that he was going to own a piece of California before he died. He worked saved, and in 1951 used money from the GI Bill, a federal program that gave returning American veterans low-interest loans to purchase homes and land to buy these 10 acres for $4,200. He planted lemons, dug a well, and built the first room of this house himself in the summer of 1952. No one spoke while Glenn told that story. Even Fletcher was quiet for a moment. Then Fletcher's phone vibrated against the tablecloth, and the moment passed. I set my knife and fork down and looked at the folder near the breadbasket. Then I looked at Fletcher. "That land is not mine to sell," I said. The table went quiet in the specific way tables go quiet when someone says something true and inconvenient. "It belongs to the man who built this house, and dead men do not sign contracts." No one answered. Constance coughed once lightly into her napkin. I excused myself to retrieve a bottle of wine I had been saving, a 2003 Bordeaux I kept for occasions worth marking. I walked to the base of the staircase and started up. I had climbed those 20 steps of white oak more times than I could count, and I knew every sound they made. What I did not know was that someone was already rising from the table behind me. I was 3 steps up when I heard the chair scrape. I looked back over my shoulder. Fletcher Morrow was on his feet, moving toward the staircase without a word to anyone at the table, his eyes already on the steps above me. The footsteps behind me had a particular quality to them. I had climbed that staircase for 40 years. I knew the way sound moved in that stairwell, how voices from the dining room carried upward through the oak steps, how each footfall was absorbed and then released by the grain of the wood. The steps following me were measured, deliberate, placed carefully so as not to be heard until they were already close. That was the first thing I noticed. The second was the silence from below. No one in the dining room called after Fletcher to ask where he was going. The landing between the first and second floors was 4 feet wide, with a half wall on one side and smooth plaster on the other. I had turned on that landing without thinking about it more times than I could count. I turned, and Fletcher Morrow was much closer behind me than he had any reason to be. He stood 2 steps below me, his right shoulder angled slightly toward the wall, his face holding the expression he used in business meetings, patient, attentive, already certain of what was going to happen. He said something about the wine, about whether I needed a hand carrying it back down. I heard the shape of the words more than the meaning. What I remember with complete clarity is what came after. There was contact. His foot placed with precision in the path of my left foot as I completed the turn. Not the stumble of a man who misjudged the space. The placement was deliberate, exact in the way that only intention produces. I felt the resistance, felt my weight shift forward, with nothing underneath it, reached for the wall and found no purchase. In the fraction of a second before I fell, I looked at his face. Fletcher Morrow was smiling. Not the version of the smile he used in rooms with other people. The other kind. The kind that surfaces when a man believes he is the only witness to himself. Then the stairs came. 20 steps, and I felt the better part of them on the way down. I am not going to pretend otherwise or make it sound like something from a film. A fall like that at 68 is not one moment. It is a sequence, the edge of a step catching the shoulder, the rail meeting the elbow at the wrong angle, the corner of a tread driving into the left side of the rib cage, with a sound I felt rather than heard. Then the hardwood floor of the foyer. Then the particular silence that follows a loud thing. I lay still and took stock, not because I was incapacitated. I have always been a man who thinks before he acts, and even at the bottom of those stairs, with 2 ribs cracked, and my lower back broadcasting signals up my spine, I thought first. I was conscious. My fingers could register the grain of the floor beneath them. When I tested my legs with careful small movements, they were present and responding. The pain was real and serious, the kind that announces genuine damage, but it was not the deeper, quieter warning of something permanently taken. I waited to see who would come first. Claudia appeared in the foyer entrance. She stopped at the threshold with her arms crossed, one hand cupping the opposite elbow, and looked at me on the floor with an expression I can only describe as assessment. She did not come closer. Then she spoke. "Get up," she said, her voice flat, the patience already gone from it. "I know you're fine, Dad." She stood there and watched as if calculating whether the situation required her to participate. Fletcher descended the stairs at a composed pace, one hand trailing the rail. He reached the bottom, looked at me on the floor, and shook his head with the particular slowness of a man confirming a prediction. "He's doing this for the sympathy," he said. Not loudly, not performing for the room, just saying it. Then here we go. Old man takes a fall and suddenly nobody has to discuss anything. No one told him to be quiet. No one corrected him. Constance stepped into the doorway a moment later. Both hands pressed over her mouth. I looked for what I would have expected, what any husband of 38 years would have expected, and did not find it. Her eyes were dry. Her posture was upright. She lowered her hands after a moment. "Maybe," she said, in a voice that had the particular flatness of a line prepared in advance, "he will do anything to ruin an evening." Glenn Whitaker came from deeper in the dining room, moving faster than any of them, his phone already in his hand. Glenn was a man who had sat at too many bedsides to waste time deciding whether something was serious. Reed came from the kitchen doorway. I heard him before I saw him, rapid steps across the hardwood, then the sound of his knees coming down on the floor beside me. His hands were cold when they found my shoulder, and when I felt them, they were shaking. Slightly controlled, the way a person shakes when they are holding something in rather than letting it show. It was the only thing I saw in that room that I believed completely. "Don't move," he said close to my ear. "Tell me what hurts." I told him. He took my hand and held it. He did not say anything else. He did not need to. Glenn was already giving the address to the Riverside County emergency dispatcher in a calm, measured voice. and I focused on keeping my breathing steady, deliberate, even because the way a man breathes under pressure tells everyone in the room more than he may intend to share. At some point, Fletcher moved away from the base of the stairs. I heard footsteps, then the sound of a chair being pulled out in the dining room, then the soft double click of a briefcase latch being fastened. He had come upstairs with a purpose, and he had accomplished it. There was nothing left on the landing that interested him. Reed was still kneeling beside me when he looked up at the wall above the staircase. I followed his gaze without moving my head. The security camera mounted at the ceiling junction, a compact unit installed the previous month to cover the foyer, and the lower portion of the staircase had its indicator light blinking in an irregular pattern. Red, then a pause. Red, then a pause. Not the steady green light that confirmed the system was actively recording. Something had disrupted the connection, or the recording itself, which produces that specific, irregular blink on most commercial security units. Someone had interfered with it. Reed looked at the light for a long moment, without speaking. Then he looked at me. His expression did not change. He reached into his jacket pocket, and I heard the faint sound of his phone screen activating. Then he put it away without dialing. The ambulance arrived 11 minutes after Glenn's call. The paramedics assessed 2 fractured ribs on the left side and a lumbar contusion, bruising and swelling in the lower back that would take weeks to resolve. They brought a stretcher. Reed walked beside it the entire way to the front door. Constance followed us at a distance I measured without meaning to in exact feet. The ambulance brought me into the emergency bay at Inland Valley Medical Center at 20 minutes past 8 that evening. Inland Valley Medical Center is a real working hospital in Wildomar on the southwestern edge of Riverside County, the kind of facility that handles the emergencies of several surrounding communities and does not have the luxury of being slow about it. The intake bay smelled of antiseptic and floor wax, and something underneath both of those that hospitals accumulate from years of absorbing the worst moments of ordinary lives. The fluorescent lights above the gurney were the kind that do not flicker. They simply are constant and indifferent, regardless of who is beneath them. Reed rode with me. He was the one who told the paramedics my medical history while I focused on breathing at a rate that communicated control rather than distress. A man lying on a gurney has very few instruments of dignity left to him. Measured breathing is one of them. The others arrived 7 minutes after we did in Fletcher's car. A doctor came within the hour. He confirmed the diagnosis the paramedics had initially suggested: 2 fractured ribs on the left side, second and third, and a lumbar contusion, bruising, and inflammation in the lower spinal region that would require rest and time. He told me I would remain overnight for observation. I told him my prior health had been excellent. He noted it in the chart, and I believed he meant it as a compliment. Before the others had settled into the waiting area, Constance came to the bay briefly, perhaps 5 minutes after the initial intake, while the doctor was still reviewing my chart in the corridor. She set a thermos on the tray table beside the bed. She said it would help me rest. She said she had made it before they left the house. I did not drink from it. Through the gap in the curtain surrounding my bay, I could see into the waiting area at the end of the corridor. Constance sat in one of the plastic chairs with both hands flat on her thighs and her back straight. Her expression at that distance read as grief. She had positioned herself directly within sight line of the nursing station, the place in the room where the most people would see her. Fletcher stood near the window on the far side of the room, his phone in his hand, already managing something else. Claudia sat 3 chairs away from both of them, her coat still buttoned, her eyes on the middle distance. Glenn Whitaker sat beside Reed near the corridor entrance. He was not performing anything. He was simply present. That was all, and it was enough. A nurse came in to complete the intake assessment. Her name was Diane Kowalski. I had time to read her badge while she worked a woman in her mid-40s, with the measured efficiency of someone who had been doing this long enough that competence and care had become the same reflex. She went through the standard sequence: blood pressure, pulse, pupil response, the mobility of each limb. Then she paused. She was looking at the area above my right temple, where the hair had been thinning noticeably for the past several months. She said nothing about it, but I watched her register it and hold the observation. She asked me to extend both hands, palms down. There was a tremor in the fingers of my left hand, faint but consistent, something I had noticed myself in recent weeks and attributed to age. She wrote something in the chart and did not explain what. She noted the thermos on the tray table, picked it up, examined it without comment, and when she left the room, she took it with her. When she finished, she paused at the curtain's edge. "Is your son in the waiting area?" she asked. "The younger man who came in with you." I told her Reed was outside. She nodded once and left. Glenn came to the bay entrance 20 minutes later when Constance had gone to the restroom and Fletcher had stepped outside. He kept his voice low. He told me he had dismissed what I said on the phone 3 weeks ago, that something had been wrong, for months wrong, in a way that had nothing to do with age or tiredness. He said he had told himself I was speaking in figures. "I was wrong to dismiss it," he said. I did not argue with him. Diane Kowalski appeared at the curtain gap a second time. She spoke briefly to Reed and he followed her out. He was back in under 3 minutes. He took a small folded piece of paper from his jacket pocket, read it once, folded it, and returned it to his pocket without a word. At the door of the new room that night before he left, I asked him directly what she had written. Reed stood at the threshold for a moment. "Something I need to follow up on tonight," he said. "Before tomorrow morning." The door clicked shut. I lay in the particular silence of a hospital at night and felt the pressure of something that had not yet arrived but was already close. I had a feeling I was about to find out. I slept 4 hours that night. Not because of the pain, the medication managed most of it, but because a man cannot rest easily when he suspects that the ground beneath him has been dissolving for the better part of a year, and he has only just begun to understand how far down the erosion goes. By 8 o'clock on the morning of November 29th, the room had changed character entirely. The night staff had turned the building over to the day shift, and the corridor outside my door had acquired the purposeful noise of a hospital. In daylight, voices at the nursing station, a supply cart rolling past. The clear mechanical sound of a call bell answered without delay. Reed was already in the chair beside my bed. I did not know how long he had been there. He was holding a paper cup of coffee and looking at something on his phone when I opened my eyes, and when he saw me awake, he put the phone away without finishing what he was reading. We had not discussed what Diane Kowalski had written on that piece of paper. At 9:45, the door to my room opened. A woman I had not yet seen came in, closed the door behind her, and introduced herself. Her name was Dr. Nora Carmichael, the attending physician assigned to my case, which meant she was the doctor legally responsible for my treatment and my records during my time at Inland Valley. She appeared to be in her early 50s, with short hair going gray at the temples, and the manner of someone who has delivered unwelcome information often enough to know that clarity is a form of respect rather than cruelty. She carried a printed document in a manila folder and set it on the tray table at the foot of the bed without opening it immediately. She looked at me, then at Reed, and asked whether I wanted my son present for the conversation. I told her Reed stays. She opened the folder. The results she presented were from the toxicology panel that Reed had requested the previous evening. He had spoken directly with Dr. Carmichael at the hospital late that night, presented Diane's written observation, and asked for an urgent heavy metal screening, what hospitals classify as a stat order, meaning the laboratory prioritizes it ahead of routine work. The results had come back within the expected window of approximately 24 hours. A heavy metal toxicology panel measures the concentration of metallic compounds in the blood, and in cases where chronic exposure is suspected, in a sample of hair. Hair is useful for this purpose because metals accumulate along the hair shaft as it grows at a predictable rate. By analyzing different sections of a hair strand, a laboratory can determine not only whether a person has been exposed to a particular compound, but roughly how long the exposure has been occurring. My blood thallium level was significantly elevated. Dr. Carmichael explained what that meant. A normal thallium reading in the blood is below 2 micrograms per liter. My reading was well above that threshold, high enough that the laboratory had flagged it immediately. The hair analysis confirmed sustained exposure over a period of approximately 5 to 6 months. Then she explained what thallium is, because most people do not know, and I did not fully know either, even though I was the one who had been living with it in my body. Thallium sulfate is a heavy metallic compound. It has no color. It has no odor. It dissolves completely in water and in most liquids, leaving no visible residue and altering the taste of a drink only subtly and only at elevated concentrations over time. The United States banned thallium sulfate for household use in 1972 because of the number of poisonings, accidental and deliberate, it caused when it was sold commercially as a pesticide. It remains obtainable through certain industrial and chemical supply channels. Administered in small, repeated doses over several months, its effects include progressive hair loss, damage to the peripheral nervous system, the network of nerves running from the spine into the limbs, which produces trembling in the hands and feet, and deterioration of neurological function that can in time become permanent. I asked one question. At what point does the nerve damage stop being reversible? She said that depended on current levels and whether exposure continued. If it stopped now, meaningful recovery was possible. If it continued at the present dosage for 3 to 4 more weeks, certain neurological effects would be irreversible. I nodded. Reed sat without moving. Dr. Carmichael then explained her legal position. Under California Penal Code Section 11,166 and the state's Welfare and Institutions Code Section 15,630, physicians are classified as mandatory reporters, meaning they are legally required to report suspected abuse of an elder, defined as anyone 65 or older, to law enforcement as promptly as the situation allows. The requirement is not optional. A mandatory reporter who fails to act can face criminal liability. She had contacted the Riverside County Sheriff's Department the previous evening after reviewing the initial panel findings with the laboratory. She had spoken with a Detective Farrell. He had confirmed receipt and asked to be called again once I was awake and coherent. Reed asked whether the findings would be communicated to anyone else within the building, specifically to the family members who had been in the waiting area. Dr. Carmichael said her legal obligation was to law enforcement, and she had fulfilled it. What the nursing staff communicated to visitors was a separate matter within her authority to manage. She held my eyes steadily for a moment when she said it. Reed said, 48 hours. We need the people in this building who are not law enforcement to remain unaware of what that panel shows. She considered that. Then she said she would consult with Detective Farrell, and in the interim, she would not discuss the panel findings with anyone outside this room. She took the folder, gave me a single nod, and left. The room was quiet after the door closed. Through the window, a narrow strip of California sky, pale, cold-looking for late November, the kind of blue that belongs to mornings that have not yet decided whether to warm up. There is a bitter taste, I said after a while. In the mornings, I have noticed it for months. I put it down to the knee medication, or to getting older. I told myself I was being oversensitive. Reed did not say anything. I was not being oversensitive, I said. No, he said. You were not. 38 years. The same hands that had prepared what I ate and drank every morning for 38 years. You do not question the floor you have walked on your entire adult life, not until the day it occurs to you to look down, and you realize someone has been removing boards from underneath you in the dark, one at a time, while you were looking in every other direction. I asked Reed what he needed to do next. He said he needed a few hours outside the building alone to work through something. I told him to go. He took his jacket from the back of the chair, touched my shoulder once briefly, and walked out without ceremony. From the third-floor window of my room, I watched the hospital parking lot. After a few minutes, he came out through the main entrance, crossed to his car, and got in. He did not start the engine. He sat in the driver's seat and opened a laptop. The screen lit up. He began to type with the focus of a man who has already decided what he is looking for and is simply locating the door. I watched him for a long time. 68 years I had been the one who handled things, who stood between my family and whatever needed standing between. Now my body was in a hospital bed because someone had been quietly removing my capacity to resist, and my son was sitting in a parking lot on a November morning trying to figure out what I could no longer do myself. There is a particular kind of helplessness that has nothing to do with weakness. I did not enjoy it, but I kept watching the parking lot. The morning of November 30th arrived as a gray line along the eastern hills, and I had been watching it come since 5 o'clock. Sleep had left me around 2 in the morning and not returned. That is what happens when a man knows enough to understand that something is wrong, but not yet enough to see the full dimensions of it. The night gives you nothing useful to add, so you lie in the dark and let the ceiling tell you whatever it has to say, which is never very much. Reed came back to the room at 8:15. He had gone to his apartment, slept for an hour, by the look of him showered and changed clothes. He moved with the deliberate efficiency of someone who has made peace with the fact that rest is not currently available and has organized himself accordingly. He closed the room door, pulled the chair to the side of the bed, and sat down. He said, "I need to tell you what I found last night. Before I tell it, I need to say something plainly. What follows is not something I saw or did myself. These are Reed's actions and Reed's findings from the previous evening through approximately 4 in the morning, described to me the next day in the order he gathered them. I am going to recount it the way he told it, because that is the only accurate way to tell it." Constance had left her phone on the waiting room chair at approximately 8 o'clock the previous evening, when she stepped away to speak with a hospital administrator about insurance paperwork. Claudia had gone with her. Reed had watched his mother set the phone down on the seat and walk toward the front desk. He had 4 minutes, possibly a little more. He used a commercial monitoring application, the kind marketed to parents tracking their children's devices, available through ordinary download channels, to install a background program on her phone. It required physical access to an unlocked device which he had, and approximately 3 minutes to complete. He was back in his chair with his own phone in his hands before Constance returned to the waiting room. He told me this, and then he was clear about what he did not do with it. He did not share the contents with Detective Farrell. He did not print any of it for the purposes of submitting it anywhere. Under California Penal Code Section 632, accessing another person's electronic communications without their consent is unlawful. Under the Federal Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, unauthorized access to a device is a federal offense. Any material gathered through that method would be excluded from a courtroom, and any case that relied on it directly would be weakened rather than strengthened. Reed knew this before he began. He used it for one purpose only: to confirm the direction he needed to look, using methods that could actually hold up. What he read told him where to look. The messages between Constance and Fletcher went back several months. Reed read the significant ones to me from memory. He did not bring the phone with him. Fletcher to Constance 6 weeks before Thanksgiving. He has not signed yet. We need to move the transfer forward. Constance to Fletcher sometime in October. The current amount may not be producing the results we expected. We may need to adjust. Fletcher to Constance more recently. Paris is waiting for us, Connie. Reed stopped after that one and looked at the window for a moment. There was one more message he told me about. Not from Fletcher, but from Constance to a woman she had been friends with before we were married. A name I knew, someone from a time in our lives I had not thought about in years. The message had been sent the previous spring, when we had been arguing about the sale, and I had thought the argument was finished when I walked away from it. In that message, Constance had written, "I have loved him for 38 years. But I cannot spend what is left of my life waiting for a piece of land to matter. I do not want to die with nothing that belongs to me." Reed read it to me, and then looked at the window again. I did not say anything for a while. There are things a man can hear and process, and things that require a moment outside of any response he has available to him. That message was the second kind. Not because of the anger it might have produced. I had already moved past the place in this where anger was the leading feeling. It was something quieter than that, and slower, and in some ways harder to name. 38 years, whatever she had felt at the beginning, or the middle, or anywhere in between, by the time she wrote that message in the spring, she had already decided. She had decided in private, in a note to a friend, and not once in all the months since had she said it to me out loud. That is a particular kind of grief. It does not arrive with any noise at all. Reed moved forward. He told me he had confirmed the direction but done nothing with the phone contents. He would build the case with what could be used. At 11:23 that night, his phone rang with a number he did not recognize. The Pendleton Estates public property filings listed Reed as an authorized contact for correspondence related to the property, a detail Margaret Dunn had added to the record 2 years prior at my request. Carlos Vega had found it the same way he found everything else through the public record. He answered because he was awake working, and because a call that late to an unrecognized number from the same area code is worth answering when your father is in the hospital. The caller gave his name as Carlos Vega. He said he was a real estate developer who had been working the commercial land market in Riverside County for 15 years, and that he had been attempting to assemble a competing offer on a parcel of land near the Interstate 15 corridor in Temecula before another buyer closed the door on him. He said he had done routine background research on the transaction afterward, the way a developer does when he loses a deal he thought he was going to win, and had found something he could not set aside. A deposit agreement was on file at the Riverside County Recorder's Office, the agency where real estate transactions are registered and made publicly available. The agreement documented earnest money paid toward the purchase of the Pendleton property 3 months prior, and it carried the signature of the owner of record. The owner of record was Harlan Pendleton. Carlos Vega told Reed that he had read real estate documents his entire career, and he knew the difference between a genuine signature and an approximation of one. The handwriting on that agreement was close. Someone had studied the reference carefully. But the pen pressure was wrong, the forward slant was off by several degrees, and the way the capital letters were constructed did not match the pattern on the original deed. He had double-checked against 2 other publicly filed documents bearing Harlan Pendleton's signature. The difference was consistent across all 3 comparisons. He said he thought the family should know. Reed thanked him, and they agreed to meet. Reed ended the call. Carlos Vega called back within 2 minutes with a second piece of information. 1. He said he had held back initially because he was not certain he had traced it far enough to be confident. The purchasing entity on the deposit agreement, Pacific Meridian Ventures, had a shareholder structure that was partly obscured through a holding company incorporated in Delaware, a legal but commonly used method for keeping beneficial ownership out of easy public view. Carlos had spent 2 weeks following the ownership chain through available corporate records. One of the actual owners holding 15% of the venture through a subsidiary entity was a person named Claudia Morrow. Reed sat in his car in the hospital parking lot for a while, after that call ended, not doing anything in particular. That was the last thing he told me. He said it, and then he stopped, and he looked at me in the way he used to look at me when he was a child, and had brought me a problem he did not know how to solve himself. I looked at the ceiling of my hospital room. "All right," I said. He nodded. "All right," I said again. Not for Reed, for myself. The rest of that Saturday came to me in pieces. Reed had left the hospital room at 10 o'clock in the morning, with a list of things to do that he had not written down anywhere because he had not needed to. Over the course of the next several hours, he called me 3 times. The first call came from the road heading north. The second came from a parking lot in Riverside. The third came at 6:47 in the evening, when it was already dark outside, and I had finished most of my hospital dinner without registering much of it. I will tell what each call contained. The first came at 11:45, while the weather forecast on the muted television was cycling through the same predictions for the third time. Reed had driven to the Pendleton estate directly after leaving me. Constance had arrived at the hospital that morning at 9 o'clock. I had seen her come through the corridor door with a thermos of coffee and the same composed expression she had been using all weekend. That put Reed at the house alone, which he had counted on. The kitchen of the estate runs along the back of the building, looking out toward the garden. The cabinet above the refrigerator is where Constance kept her household supplements and medications, and I had watched her open that cabinet every morning for years without attaching any particular thought to it. The cabinet she used, the routine she kept, the glass of warm liquid she set beside my coffee each morning for the past 6 months. Reed went directly to it and found 2 amber-colored glass bottles on the lower shelf, unlabeled, except for handwritten dates on the caps in Constance's handwriting. He took a measured sample from each bottle using sterile collection materials from a pharmacy he had stopped at on the way. He sealed and packaged both samples and drove them to a private toxicology laboratory in San Diego that accepts urgent submissions outside standard business hours, the kind of service used when a result is needed in less than the standard processing window. A rush submission of this kind is given priority handling by the laboratory, with results available within approximately 24 hours for a higher fee. Before he ended the call, Reed asked me whether he had my authorization to spend what this would cost. I told him to stop asking me that kind of question. The second call came at 3 in the afternoon. After delivering the samples to the San Diego laboratory, Reed had driven north to downtown Riverside, where Carlos Vega maintained an office on the 4th floor of a building across from the county courthouse. Carlos was a man of roughly 50, Reed told me, with a methodical manner, someone who selected his words at approximately the same pace he did everything else, which was unhurried and deliberate. He had placed the deposit agreement on his desk before Reed arrived. Reed described it. 3 pages printed on legal paper with the Pacific Meridian Ventures letterhead across the top. On the final page, a signature line reading Harlan A. Pendleton in handwriting that was careful and close, but not mine. Carlos walked Reed through the comparison he had made. The capital H in my first name is something I have written the same way since I was 20 years old. The crossbar sits at a slightly lower position than standard. On this document, the crossbar was placed higher at the geometric center of the letter. The capital P in Pendleton. I have always left the loop slightly open, a gap where the stroke curves back around. The signature on this agreement closed the loop completely. The pen pressure across the entire document was unnaturally even in the way that comes from copying. Rather than signing a person, writing their own name does not think about pressure, and so it varies in ways that are almost impossible to replicate deliberately. Carlos had checked against 3 other documents bearing my signature that were on file in the public records of Riverside County. The differences were consistent across all comparisons. He provided Reed with a written summary of his findings, a copy of the deposit agreement, and a signed statement confirming he was prepared to give testimony if asked. He had been prepared to do this before Reed walked in the door. He also provided printed documentation related to the Pacific Meridian Ventures ownership structure. Tracing the chain had required patience rather than any specialized access. The information existed in publicly available corporate filings in Delaware, accessible through state business registry services. The ownership ran from Pacific Meridian Ventures into a subsidiary holding entity, and from that entity to Claudia Morrow as a 15% beneficial owner. At a transaction value of $50 million, that position would produce $7.5 million for a person whose name appeared nowhere in any document directly connected to the deal. Reed thanked him, took the materials, and drove back toward Wildemar. The third call came at 6:47. A woman named Margaret Dunn had reached Reed that afternoon, shortly after his meeting with Carlos Vega. Margaret had served as my property attorney and estate planning counsel for 11 years. Her name and contact information were listed as counsel of record in the public property filings for the Temecula Valley estate, which meant that when another attorney sent formal correspondence relating to the property, her office received it. She had received a letter that afternoon from an attorney named Graham Pemberton. Pemberton was listed as legal counsel for Pacific Meridian Ventures, and his letter stated that all relevant parties wished to meet at Inland Valley Medical Center on Friday, December 6th to finalize the property purchase agreement. The letter expressed the expectation that the owner of record would be sufficiently recovered by that date to review and sign the necessary documents. Margaret told Reed the letter struck her as professionally irregular for several reasons. Her office had not been informed of any active purchase agreement. No draft agreement had been provided for her review, as would be standard practice when the other side had counsel of record on file. She said she intended to attend any meeting involving the property on Friday, regardless of what Graham Pemberton's letter anticipated, and she wanted Reed to know she was already making the relevant preparations. Reed told me all of this on the phone in the hospital parking lot before going home. I lay on the hospital bed and looked at the ceiling for a while. Friday, December 6th. 6 days from Thanksgiving. 4 days from where I was lying right now. The room settled into its nighttime sounds. The cart in the hall, the low hum of the building's ventilation, the faint voices of the nursing staff talking at their station show about something ordinary. None of it had anything to do with me. I thought about the 2 amber glass bottles in the cabinet above my refrigerator. I thought about 6 months of mornings, the glass of warm liquid Constance placed beside my coffee without being asked, without variation, without explanation, because that was simply what she did, and I had never had cause to look at it differently. I had given her 38 years of reasons not to look differently. And then I thought about Friday and what 4 days is and what it is not. We're halfway through, and what's coming next, I didn't see it myself until it was almost too late. Before I continue, drop the number 7 in the comments. It tells me you're still here, and trust me, you want to be here for what comes next. A note: parts of this story contain fictional elements shaped for entertainment and to carry something worth hearing. If that's not for you, this is a good place to step away. Sunday morning arrived without announcement, the way winter mornings do in Temecula Valley. Thin light, low temperatures, a sky that had not yet decided what it wanted to be. Through the hospital window, the eastern hills were the color of old paper. The call came at 7:20 from a number I did not recognize. The man on the other end introduced himself as Detective Ray Farrell of the Riverside County Sheriff's Department, Major Crimes Division. He explained, the investigator to whom Dr. Carmichael had reported on the night of my admission, the person who had been building the case file for the past 3 days while I lay in this room learning the shape of what had been done to me. This was the first time I had spoken with him directly. He had an economical manner. Not unfriendly, but sparing in the way that people who spend their working lives with difficult situations tend to be. They learn not to use more words than the situation requires, because the situations themselves supply more than enough. He told me Reed had hand-delivered the San Diego laboratory analysis to his office late the previous evening. Both samples taken from the bottles at the estate had tested positive for thallium sulfate at concentrations consistent with chronic low-dose administration over several months. One sample showed a measurably higher concentration than the other, which indicated an adjustment in dosage at some point during the 6-month period. These samples, he said, had been legally obtained from the property of the owner of record. The laboratory documentation established a clear chain of custody. Both elements, the samples and the documentation, were admissible as physical evidence in any subsequent legal proceeding. He was formally opening a criminal investigation. He asked how I was. I told him I was ready for the week to move faster than hospital weeks tend to move. He said he understood that. Then he asked me something I had not anticipated. He asked about the security camera mounted above the staircase at the Pendleton estate. Who had installed it when and whether footage from the system was stored anywhere outside the property. I told him Reed had installed it. He said he would follow up with Reed on that point directly. The next 2 days happened mostly beyond the walls of my room, and the information reached me through 2 channels: Reed, who came and went, and Margaret Dunn, who called me directly on Monday morning, with the even tone of a woman who had been working through the weekend and did not regard this as remarkable. On Sunday, Margaret had filed an emergency ex parte motion in Riverside County Superior Court. An ex parte motion is a legal request submitted to a judge by one party without requiring the presence of the opposing party, a procedure permitted in urgent circumstances where the standard waiting period for a scheduled hearing would cause irreparable harm. Margaret's motion cited California Welfare and Institutions Code Section 15,610, which defines financial elder abuse as the taking, concealing, or misappropriation of an elder's property or financial resources for the benefit of another. She argued that the evidence already gathered, the forged deposit agreement, documented by Carlos Vega, the undisclosed shareholder interest, traced through Delaware filings, and the toxicology results from both my blood panel and the estate samples established sufficient and urgent grounds for court-supervised financial investigation of the parties connected to Pacific Meridian Ventures. The court approved the motion within 48 hours. Margaret described the results on Monday morning: a financial account in the Cayman Islands, a British territory in the Caribbean, where banking privacy laws have historically been among the most protective in the world, had received $2.3 million in wire transfers from a domestic account linked to Pacific Meridian Ventures. The Cayman account was held under a corporate name registered in the British Virgin Islands. The chain of ownership, when traced backward, led to Claudia Morrow. Obtaining this information had not required cooperation from the Cayman Bank itself. Under the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act, a federal law enacted in 2010 that requires American financial institutions to report international wire transfers and foreign account activity to federal regulators, the bank on the American side of those wire transfers was subject to reporting obligations. The court order issued from Riverside County Superior Court compelled that U.S. institution to produce its records related to the transfers in question. What that produced was documentation of $2.3 million moved from a domestic Pacific Meridian Ventures account to Claudia Morrow's offshore structure across a period of several months. If the $50 million property transaction had closed as intended, her remaining share would have followed by the same route. Margaret relayed this to me in a tone that required no additional commentary from either of us. That evening I was sitting up in the hospital bed for the first time in several days, the ribs permitted it now, with deliberate effort, looking out the window at the parking lot below. The overhead lamps in the lot cast a particular amber light across the asphalt, turning the cars parked beneath them into shapes rather than objects. I recognized the vehicle because I had watched it pull into and back out of the Pendleton driveway for 8 years. A dark sport utility vehicle, the same model Claudia had driven since she and Fletcher relocated to Murrieta. The license plate matched what I carried in memory, which is the kind of detail a man retains without deciding to over years of ordinary family gatherings. It was parked in the far corner of the lot, near the exit, away from the entrance. The engine went off. No one got out. Other cars pulled in and departed around it while it sat. After what I estimated to be 20 minutes, the engine started again. The vehicle reversed out of the space, moved toward the exit lane, and drove away. No one had come inside. I did not know what she had been doing in that car during those 20 minutes. I did not know if she had come close to opening the door and then decided against it, or if she had only needed to sit in the parking lot for a length of time before she was able to go wherever she was going next. I could not see through the windows. I would not have understood what I saw if I could have. I only knew what was in front of me. She had been here within a short walk of this building, and she had not come in. Some things a father does not say out loud, not even to himself. Shortly before 9 that evening, Farrell called Reed a second time. Reed stopped by my room on his way home and told me what was said. Farrell had returned to the question from the morning the security camera above the staircase. He had asked Reed specifically, was there a copy of the footage from the night of the fall that existed somewhere outside the Pendleton estate? Reed looked at me when he repeated the question, the way a man looks when he is confirming something he has held in reserve for the right moment. I told him there was, Reed said. Farrell had been quiet on the line for a moment. Then he said, I need to see it, all of it. I gave Eugene Taft very little thought in all the months he came to the property. That was what struck me at 2 a.m. on Tuesday, December 3rd, lying in a hospital room that had acquired the particular familiarity of a place you did not choose and cannot yet leave. When I ran back through the months and tried to reconstruct what I had actually paid attention to and what I had simply allowed to pass. He had appeared in September, referred by someone whose name I could no longer recover with any certainty. A mutual acquaintance in the valley, perhaps. A card in the mail. He came on a schedule 3 times a week, moved through the property, quietly kept the garden in reasonable order, and said very little that was not directly related to the task in front of him. I had taken his silence for the self-contained manner of a working man who did not require conversation as part of his arrangement. I had paid him by check on the 1st of each month and watched him drive away and thought nothing more about it. 3 months. A man I did not know had moved through my property for 3 months, and I had assumed I understood him because he arrived when he said he would and kept his hands occupied. When Reed came to my room early Tuesday morning, he had been waiting in the corridor since just after midnight. The night nurse mentioned it when she checked on me at FI. He came in once I was awake, sat in the chair he had made his own over the course of the past several days, and told me what had happened the previous evening. Tommy Greer had appeared at the estate door at 7 o'clock on Monday. Tommy was 16, the son of the neighbor, 2 properties over, who had been cutting the grass at the Pendleton estate for 2 years. He was reliable in the way that young people sometimes are when they have been given consistent work and fair pay. And he had always conducted himself without making himself noticed. Reed had been at the estate that afternoon gathering documents for Margaret Dunn, and he was still there when Tommy knocked. Tommy told Reed he had been uneasy for several weeks. He could not fully articulate why in a way that felt sufficient to bring to anyone which was the reason he had taken this long. But he had noticed specific things. Eugene arriving at the property well before his scheduled start on 2 mornings in October. Eugene spending long periods near the eastern storage barn, not working the surrounding garden, not doing anything with a visible purpose, just standing near the structure. And on one afternoon in late November, Tommy had seen Eugene standing at the barn window with his phone raised at window level, moving the frame slowly along the glass. What he had been photographing was not the garden. Tommy had recorded an 11-second video on his own phone at that moment, not knowing precisely what to do with it, but sensing that having it was better than not having it. He showed it to Reed. The video was clear enough. Eugene Taft at the side of the barn in late afternoon, light phone held at window height, camera pointed at the interior of the building. 11 seconds, no audio, but nothing about the angle or the framing suggested anything other than what it appeared to be. Reed drove Tommy home, thanked him, and called Farrell. Farrell arrived at the estate with a colleague within 45 minutes. After reviewing the video, Farrell ran Eugene Taft's name through the department's law enforcement databases. What came back was an active private investigator's license, issued by the California Bureau of Security and Investigative Services, the state agency responsible for licensing and regulating the private investigation profession in California. Eugene's license had been current for 19 years. His professional account with LexisNexis Risk Solutions, a restricted investigative database available only to licensed investigators, law enforcement agencies, and legal professionals, showed recent activity related to searches of the Pendleton property records and personal background information on members of the Pendleton family. A licensed private investigator with 19 years of professional history had been employed as a groundskeeper on my property for 3 months. Farrell brought Eugene in for a voluntary interview at the Riverside County Sheriff's Office that evening. Reed told me the following morning that Eugene Taft was 64 years old, a compact, careful man who had sat in the interview room for a long time before he said anything. Then he had talked without stopping. Fletcher Morrow had hired him in September through a referral from a former professional contact of Fletcher's at $8,000 per month. Fletcher had specific requirements. He wanted someone on the Pendleton property with a plausible explanation for their presence who would monitor activity on the estate, noting visitors' vehicles, any meetings that appeared connected to the property's legal or financial status, and who would locate if it existed a specific document Fletcher had reason to believe was stored somewhere in the eastern storage buildings. He described it as a large brown envelope, old paper containing handwritten or typed documents he believed Harlan Pendleton kept at the property rather than with any attorney's office. Eugene had not found it in 3 months. Reed told me what Eugene had said when Farrell asked him why he had taken the job. His wife had been diagnosed with lymphoma in August. Her chemotherapy cost approximately $6,000 per month after what their insurance covered. He had done the calculation a man in his position does, and he had taken the work that was available to him. I lay in the hospital bed and held that piece of information by itself for a moment. I have tried to be a man who holds the full shape of things rather than the convenient shape. The full shape of Eugene Taft included a sick wife, a calculation made from very few options, and 19 years of working in a profession that requires both a clear legal record and an intact professional license, both of which he had now put at risk for $8,000 a month. I did not forgive what he had enabled, but I understood the arithmetic of it, which is a different and in some ways harder thing. Farrell called me directly at 8:45 that morning. He said that Eugene's account had produced one specific question he needed to put to me. Fletcher had sent Eugene to the property specifically to find a large brown envelope that he believed contained a legal document related to the estate. Did I know what Fletcher believed was in that envelope? I looked out the window at a Tuesday sky that was cleaner than the days before it, the kind of blue that comes when the wind has been through and taken the haze with it. Yes, I said. I know exactly what is in it. I told Farrell about my grandfather Harold, about the document he had prepared separately from the formal estate filing in 1963, because he had lived long enough by then to understand that the legal system could not protect intentions that were never committed to paper with sufficient specificity. The clause Harold had included in that document stated that the Pendleton property could not be sold, transferred, or encumbered without the written consent of all living direct heirs of the original owner. All living direct heirs. Reed had never consented. Reed had never been asked to consent. Farrell was quiet on the line for a moment. Fletcher doesn't know what's in it, I said. He knows the envelope exists. He has known for some time that there is a document somewhere on this property that he has not been able to find. He has spent 3 months trying. Mr. Pendleton, Farrell said, and his voice had a different quality to it, now the specific quality of a man who has seen a piece of the picture snap into place. I think you need to speak with Margaret Dunn this afternoon about how we use that document. That afternoon, Margaret Dunn arrived at 2 o'clock. She was the kind of person who treated punctuality as a professional courtesy rather than a social nicety, which I had always appreciated. She came in with a leather portfolio, a set of estate files organized by date, and the copy of my grandfather's original will that I had asked Reed to retrieve from the estate that morning. She set everything on the tray table, pulled the chair to the side of the bed, and looked at me in the direct way she always had. She had been my property attorney and estate counsel for 11 years. Over that time, she had spoken to me without unnecessary softening, which was why I had kept her. Before anything else, she said, you need to understand what this document is capable of doing and what it cannot do. What Harold Pendleton had prepared in 1963 was what attorneys call a testamentary restriction, a binding condition embedded in a will that determines what beneficiaries may and may not do with inherited property once the original owner has died. Harold had not trusted that the standard terms of a filed estate would be sufficient, so he had worked with a Riverside attorney to draft a supplementary document containing one specific clause. The Pendleton land could not be sold, encumbered, or transferred in any form without the written agreement of every surviving direct heir of the original owner. The document had been witnessed, notarized, and deliberately left separate from the formal estate filing, which was entirely within Harold's legal rights as the testator. It had remained in a brown envelope in the storage barn for 61 years, known to the immediate family and no one else. Fletcher Morrow had spent 3 months and $8,000 a month looking for something that would have made his purchase agreement worthless from the moment it was signed, regardless of whose signature appeared on it. Reed had never agreed to the sale. He would not agree to it. That made the transaction legally impossible under the terms of Harold's restriction. Margaret said she would file the document with the Riverside County Recorder's Office before the close of business that afternoon. Once recorded, the restriction would appear in any title search conducted on the property. Then Farrell joined by phone, and we talked for close to an hour about what we needed to happen before Friday. The plan once laid out was not complicated. What it required was that Constance and Fletcher believed their situation had changed in a specific and threatening way so that they would move faster than deliberate people move when they feel safe. Farrell had maintained a court-authorized wiretap on Constance's phone since November 30th, a surveillance order issued by a Riverside County Superior Court judge under California Penal Code Section 629 based on the toxicology evidence and documented elder abuse already on file. In 9 days of monitoring, Constance had said very little of investigative value over the phone. She was careful. We needed her to stop being careful. The information we would introduce was this that I had while recovering in this hospital, signed an amended will, leaving everything to Claudia and removing Reed entirely from the estate. This was not true. No such document would ever be drafted or filed. But it would reach Constance within hours of leaving the right person's mouth, and if we had read the situation correctly, it would tell her something she feared considerably more than patience, that the arrangement she had made with Fletcher was being undermined by the very person they had cut in as a partner. The fear we were engineering was specific. If Claudia stood to inherit the entire estate upon my natural death, she had no reason to share any of the property proceeds with Constance or Fletcher. Whatever private agreement the three of them had made would dissolve the moment I died without a signed sale contract. They would have poisoned a man and pushed him down a staircase for nothing. That fear, we believed, would make Constance call Fletcher. Glenn Whitaker had 2 questions when Reed reached him by phone. He asked whether what we were doing would genuinely protect Harlan. He asked whether anyone would be harmed who did not have harm coming to them. He received yes and no respectively in that order. He said he knew a woman who had moved in Constance's social circle for many years, a longtime acquaintance from the parish. Someone whose name came up at enough of the same events that a casual mention from Glenn would reach Constance by early evening. He made the call at 4:15 that afternoon. At 7:40 that evening, Constance called Fletcher. Farrell came to the room the following morning and read me the relevant portion of the transcript, the written record produced from the court-authorized recording. He read it without commentary, in the measured tone he used when he was allowing the material to speak for itself. Constance's voice per the transcript. The plan has changed. He signed it. He gave everything to Claudia and took Reed out completely. If we don't close before he dies on his own, she has the land, and we have nothing. The meeting on Friday is not optional anymore. What followed on Fletcher's end was partially obscured by ambient noise, but Constance's subsequent statements filled in the content of what he had said. She confirmed something about the current situation with the hospital visits. She mentioned a Paris account. She said Friday was now the most important day they had. I listened to Farrell read this and kept my expression where I needed it to be. Then I asked him directly, "Is what we have now sufficient?" The wiretap recording together with the toxicology reports, the physical samples from the estate, the forged deposit agreement, and Taft's testimony, it is enough to present a case, he said. But what happens on Friday is what makes the difference between a case I can argue and a case no one can argue against. I thought about that. Then let them come, I said. Farrell said he would be ready. An hour later, Dr. Carmichael stopped by the room to review my treatment progress. The chelation therapy, a daily course of Prussian blue, a compound approved by the United States Food and Drug Administration specifically for thallium poisoning, which works by binding to thallium molecules in the digestive system and carrying them out of the body before they can be reabsorbed into the bloodstream, had been underway since November 29th. My levels were measurably improving. Then she set her tablet on the tray table and showed me the numbers she had calculated. Without this treatment, she said, and if exposure had continued at the rate we documented, 3 additional weeks would have been enough to cause neurological damage we could not reverse. I looked at the numbers on the screen for a moment. 3 weeks. The second bottle Constance had brought to this building, the one Diane Kowalski had quietly removed from the room and handed to Farrell, had been intended to continue exactly what the first bottles had been doing. I had not previously considered myself a man who came within 3 weeks of irreversible things. Reconsidering that was an uncomfortable exercise. I thanked Dr. Carmichael and did not say anything further about it that evening. By Wednesday morning, I had decided what I needed to be for the next 36 hours. I had spent 68 years operating on the principle that precision was a form of respect for the people I spoke with and for the subjects themselves. I said what I meant. I meant what I said. I had very little patience for obscuring things that could be stated directly. What I needed to do now was obscure something with considerable care. Reed arrived at 8. We spent an hour working through what the afternoon would require. Fletcher and Constance had called the nursing station the previous evening to ask about visiting hours, a standard inquiry routed through the hospital's administrative line, which Farrell had already arranged to be alerted to. They would arrive between 2 and 4. This told us something specific they had not yet decided Friday was guaranteed. They were coming to evaluate. The news about the amended will which had reached Constance through the parish acquaintance the previous afternoon had made them uncertain. They needed to see the condition of the man they were planning to meet on Friday before they could feel confident about what that meeting would produce. We needed them to feel confident. What I had to offer them was a man whose thinking had softened at the edges, not collapsed, because a man who appeared incapacitated would raise immediate legal questions about whether any agreement signed on Friday was voluntary. The legal standard in California for a valid real estate contract requires that the signing party have the mental capacity to understand the nature and consequences of the transaction. If I appeared to lack that capacity, the other side would be exposed to the exact charge they were hoping to avoid. They needed me functional, but diminished, cooperative but not fully comprehending. Thallium, Dr. Carmichael had told me, produces precisely this pattern in patients at intermediate stages of exposure. Difficulty retrieving specific words, a slowing of sequential thought, a quality of cognitive delay that presents to observers as fog rather than collapse. I had experienced none of it. The chelation treatment had been initiated early enough that my cognition had not been measurably affected. But I had listened carefully when she described it, and I had retained the description. That was enough to work from. Fletcher and Constance arrived at 2:15. Constance came through the door first, carrying the thermos she had brought before, and a folded blanket that she placed at the foot of the bed without being asked. She called me a name she had used in the first years of our marriage, and had stopped using sometime in the 1990s, a diminutive the kind that belongs to a time before the routines of a long partnership replaced tenderness with efficiency. She used it now with the warmth of someone reclaiming something they had only temporarily set aside. She asked how I had slept. She asked whether the nurses were attentive. She straightened the pillow behind my head, with both hands slowly the way you would handle something fragile. Fletcher came in behind her. He shook my hand and held the handshake a moment longer than it required his eyes on my face in the specific way of a man who is watching for something and has prepared himself not to let the watching show. They were more careful than I had ever seen them. That quality of care was itself the information I needed. I let the conversation move at whatever pace they chose. I asked about the drive from Murrieta. I asked whether the road construction on the 15 was still causing delays. I listened more than I spoke, and when I spoke, I paused in places not dramatically, not in a way that called attention to itself, but with the quiet, slightly extended pause of a man for whom the next word requires a moment of retrieval it did not use to require. After 20 minutes in a natural gap, I said, "I've been thinking about the land, the property business." Fletcher went very still. The particular stillness of a man who has been waiting across a long silence for a specific sentence. "I've had a lot of time in here," I said, "going over things, thinking about what matters at this point. Whether I've been," the pause, 3 seconds, 4. "Whether I've been reasonable about it." Constance placed her hand on mine. Her fingers were warm. Fletcher said with a patience that had been prepared in advance that there was no rush. That the only consideration was my recovery. That the business side of things would wait as long as it needed to. I nodded the way a man nods when he is receiving something through gauze. I said Reed had mentioned something about a meeting scheduled for later in the week. That I thought by Friday I might be ready to sit with people and talk it through properly. Fletcher said Friday was entirely flexible. That everyone's only concern was my well-being. I thanked them for coming. I said I was getting tired. They stayed another 15 minutes. Fletcher spoke briefly with Reed by the door before they left. 2 sentences. Reed's answer brief, and then they were gone. The door settled into its frame and the corridor outside resumed its ordinary afternoon sounds. Reed sat back down. Neither of us said anything for a full minute. "How much do you think Fletcher heard?" I asked. Reed considered it. The parts he came in expecting to hear. That was the intention. Reed looked at me in the way he does when he has not yet resolved whether he is more impressed or concerned. The expression he has been making since he was about 12 years old. I had spent 68 years as a man who said what he meant. What I had done this afternoon was the precise inverse, and the precision required was not in the end so different from the other kind. The performance had worked because every word I said was true. I had been thinking about the property. I had been thinking about what mattered. I had been thinking about whether I had been reasonable. All of those things were genuinely so. The only thing I had withheld was the completeness of the thinking. I had held it completely in reserve. "One more day," I said. Reed nodded once. Outside the window, the Wednesday afternoon was going. The way December afternoons go in Southern California, not dramatic about it, just fading. Thursday would pass. Then Friday would come. And everything I had set in motion over the course of a very specific and very unpleasant week would either be sufficient or it would not. I believed it would be sufficient. I closed my eyes. Thursday came in quietly, the way the last night before, a significant thing tends to, with less ceremony than the occasion deserves, and more time to think than is entirely useful. I had been moved to a different room 2 days prior, a routine patient rotation on the third floor. The new room faced west rather than east, which meant the evening light came in from a different angle, and the parking lot was visible from a different position. A man with limited mobility and too much time learns to register small differences. They give the hours something to organize themselves around. Farrell arrived at 5 in the afternoon and went through tomorrow's logistics with the specific thoroughness of a man who has thought about very little else for the past several days. The meeting with Fletcher Morrow and Graham Pemberton was confirmed for 10 in the morning in a conference room on the hospital's administrative level. Hospitals maintain such rooms for exactly this kind of situation, legal or financial matters involving patients who cannot travel. The space was neutral with a table and appropriate seating, and it gave Farrell considerably more operational room than a patient's room would have allowed. Margaret Dunn would be in the corridor outside the conference room before the meeting began. She would have with her a certified copy of Harold's recorded will and a formal letter from her office objecting in writing to any property transaction not first reviewed by counsel of record. She would not be invited into the room. She did not need to be. Farrell and 2 members of his unit would be in the building, not visible to the other parties. 1 officer would be in the lobby, 1 in the administrative area corridor. The building's head of security had been briefed. Reed would be in the room as family. My role was to listen, to allow Fletcher and Pemberton to present whatever they had prepared, to ask reasonable questions if any occurred to me, to sign nothing. I told Farrell I understood all of that. He also told me that a Riverside County Superior Court judge had signed an emergency protective order under California's Elder Abuse and Dependent Adult Civil Protection Act. The order authorized him to detain, without further procedural steps, any person who, in the presence of law enforcement, engaged in conduct constituting active financial elder abuse against a protected individual. In practical terms, if Fletcher moved physically to pressure me, or if Pemberton produced materials traceable to the forged deposit agreement, Farrell had authority to act on the spot. He said he did not expect it to come to that. He said the order existed for the gap between expectations and outcomes. After he left, Reed stayed. He worked on his laptop at the tray table while I lay in the partial dark of the room and let my mind do what it needed to do with the hours. Around 7, Reed looked up from the screen. Someone tried to access the cloud account, he said. He had been reviewing the access log for the cloud camera service, the off-site encrypted backup storage where the footage from the staircase camera at the Pendleton estate was held. The system maintained a record of every login attempt made to the account, successful or otherwise, along with the IP address from which each attempt originated. There were 2 entries that were not his. Both had been made on the morning of November 29th, approximately 8 hours after the fall. The attempts had originated from an IP address that the service's geolocation tool associated with a residential area in the Murrieta vicinity of Riverside County. Both attempts had failed. Reed had enabled 2-step verification when he created the account. In October, the system required a separate confirmation code sent to his registered phone before any login could complete. Whoever had been trying to get in did not have access to Reed's phone. The footage remained intact and untouched from the moment it was recorded. Reed called Farrell with the information. Farrell said he would have someone run the IP trace first thing in the morning before the meeting. He said it added precision to a picture that was already clear. When Reed ended the call, the room was quiet. I asked him to take the notepad from the nightstand drawer. He set it on the tray table with the hospital-issue pen and did not ask what I needed it for. I wrote for close to half an hour. I am not a man who has found it easy at any point in my life to say certain things on paper. What I was trying to say in this particular letter was harder than most. When I had finished, I folded the pages twice and wrote Reed's name on the outside in the same hand I had used on his birthday cards since he was old enough to read. "This is only if something goes wrong tomorrow," I said. He took it without opening it. He placed it in the inside pocket of his jacket, with a deliberateness that told me he understood exactly what kind of letter it was. "Nothing is going to go wrong," he said. "I know that," I said. "Keep it anyway." He did. We spent another hour in the room, mostly without conversation. Reed made tea from the machine down the hall, the closest the building could offer, and brought it back without being asked. The hospital moved through the rhythms of its Thursday evening, the shift change, the dinner collection, the sound of the parking lot below settling into nighttime. The ordinary sounds of a building full of people managing difficult situations quietly. At 9:30, Reed stood and put his jacket on. At the door, he stopped and turned back. "Farrell confirmed the timestamp," he said. "The recording runs from 8:41 in the evening to 8:57. It captured everything from the moment we sat down at the table to," he paused, "to the end of what happened on those stairs." I looked at him for a moment. "All right," I said. He nodded and left. I lay in the room with the dark and the quiet, and the particular weight of what everything meant in that context, and I let the hours pass at whatever speed they chose. There was nothing left to do. Tomorrow would either be enough or it would not. I had spent 68 years building, protecting, and apparently failing to watch the right things closely enough. Tomorrow was the accounting for all of it. I did not try to sleep. Before I show you what was captured on that camera and what happened in that conference room on Friday morning, I need to know you're still with me. Comment the word "land" below. If you've made it this far, you deserve to hear how this ends. Note elements of this story are fictional, built for entertainment and reflection. Any resemblance to names or places is coincidental, but the lesson inside is not. Farrell came to the room at 5:30 in the morning. I heard him before I saw him, the sound of purposeful footsteps in a corridor that was otherwise quiet. The kind of step that does not adjust its pace for the acoustic softness of the hour. He knocked twice, came in, and Reed followed him with a hard-sided laptop case under his arm that he set on the tray table without ceremony. The window showed the specific dark that comes in the last hour before dawn, not night's dark, but the kind in which you can already feel the light assembling behind the eastern hills before you can see it. Farrell sat down. He did not open with anything that was not the matter at hand. "We reviewed the footage last night," he said. "I had a forensic image analyst look at specific frames by 7 o'clock this morning. I want you to see what we have before we go into that conference room." Reed opened the laptop and turned the screen so I could see it from the bed. The camera at the Pendleton estate had been mounted at the junction of the ceiling, and the wall above the staircase angled downward at approximately 45 degrees, covering the lower portion of the staircase and the full landing between floors. At that angle, the lens looked down onto the top of each person's head and shoulders as they moved through its field and onto the landing itself at sufficient resolution to track foot placement precisely. The recording had been triggered by motion and had begun at 7:46 in the evening on November 28th, when I entered the frame at the base of the stairs and started to climb. Reed described the frames in the sequence in which they occurred. I watched each still image on the screen as he spoke. 7:46, 8 seconds, Harlan Pendleton at the base of the stairs, beginning to climb, frame quality clear. 7:47, 41 seconds, a second figure entering the frame at the bottom of the stairs. Fletcher Morrow. His distance behind Harlan was approximately 4 steps at the moment he entered the frame. That distance narrowed steadily as Harlan climbed toward the landing. 7:48, 2 seconds. Harlan on the landing turning. Fletcher 2 steps below his right shoulder, angled toward the wall. In this frame, Reed said Fletcher's foot positioning was already different from its earlier position in the staircase. His right foot was tracking forward of the step's center line. 7:48, 11 seconds. This was the frame Farrell had marked in the file. Fletcher Morrow's right foot seen from above extended forward and to the left at an angle that the forensic analyst had described in her preliminary notes as inconsistent with a person maintaining a static position on a step. The angle required deliberate muscular engagement, not a shift in weight from one foot to the other, not a stumble forward, a lateral extension directed at a specific point in the available space. A placement. 7:48, 14 seconds, contact. Harlan's left foot meeting Fletcher's extended right foot in the frame. The physics of the contact visible in the positions of both bodies in that moment. Harlan's upper body beginning to tip forward, with nothing to arrest the movement. 7:48, 17 seconds, Harlan falling. The footage continued for 11 minutes after that. It showed the family arriving at the base of the stairs, one by one in the sequence I had registered from the floor. It showed Reed's knees on the hardwood, his hands on my shoulder. It showed Fletcher descending from the landing at a composed pace, stepping around the figure at the bottom of the stairs, moving toward the dining room. There was one final frame Farrell had flagged, 7:48, 13 seconds, 1 second before contact. The camera's angle at that moment produced a partial view of the right side of Fletcher Morrow's face, his jaw, his cheek, the outer corner of his right eye as he looked upward toward the landing. The frame did not capture a complete facial profile. What it captured was enough for the analyst to note in her preliminary assessment that the configuration of visible facial muscles was consistent with a voluntary upward contraction, the kind of muscular movement associated with a smile. The finding was qualified. It was preliminary. It was not the center of the evidence. It was there. I looked at the still frames for a long time after Reed finished describing them. Here is what I had known since I was lying on the floor at the bottom of those stairs on the night of November 28th, that what happened on that landing was not an accident. I had known it from the quality of the contact, the precision of it, the angle, the deliberateness of a foot placed rather than shifted. I had known it from the fraction of a second in which I looked at Fletcher Morrow's face before the stairs came. I had carried that knowledge through 8 days in this hospital room, without anything that could stand in a courtroom. Now it was on a screen in front of me, measured in fractions of a second, preserved in an encrypted server, that the person who put me at the bottom of those stairs had tried to reach within 8 hours of the event and had not been able to access. Is it enough? I asked. Farrell said, the footage combined with the toxicology reports, the physical samples from the estate, the forged deposit agreement. Taft's testimony, the wiretap recording the Cayman account documentation, and the failed login attempts that confirm consciousness of guilt, yes. It is enough. What happens in that conference room will be the final record. Reed was looking at me from the chair. I looked at him. There was nothing left to say that had not already been said or documented or folded into an inside jacket pocket against the possibility of something going wrong. The picture was complete. We had spent 8 days building it from a staircase and a hospital bed and a parking lot and a forensic laboratory and a county courthouse, and now it sat in a laptop file and a chain of custody document and a set of court orders, and in 4 hours, the people who had constructed the other version of events were going to walk into a conference room 1 floor below this one and find out what had been assembled in the space they believed they had controlled. At 7:58, Margaret Dunn called Reed's phone. He answered, listened for less than 30 seconds, and looked at me with an expression that was not surprise but occupied the same vicinity. Pemberton just came through the lobby, he said. He has a filing agent from the title company and a notary. They want to begin immediately, 2 hours ahead of schedule. I looked at the ceiling for a moment. The distance between preparation and the thing itself is always shorter than expected. Tell Margaret to hold her position, I said. Tell Farrell. Reed was already dialing before I finished the sentence. A hospital corridor at 8 in the morning has a specific character, the full apparatus of the institution in operation, moving past on both sides with the organized efficiency of a place that has processed more human difficulty than any other kind of building and has built its procedures around exactly that. A nurse I had not worked with before pushed the wheelchair. Reed walked alongside with a folder under his arm. We moved from the elevator to the administrative wing, where the floor changed from linoleum to low carpet, and the lighting shifted from clinical white to the softer neutral of rooms intended for business rather than medicine. The second door on the left had a small rectangular window. Through it, the interior lights were on and two men were already seated. I had them in view for perhaps 5 seconds before the door opened. Graham Pemberton was the taller of the two, a man in his late 50s with silver hair, good posture, and the kind of suit that belongs to attorneys who have spent decades seated across conference tables from people they are paid to persuade. He had a legal folder open in front of him and a secondary file set to his right. He looked at the door when it opened, which was the practiced attention of someone accustomed to reading an entrance. Fletcher sat beside him, positioned slightly back from the table, which is the posture of a principal who intends to let his attorney manage the opening. He had his hands folded in his lap. When he saw me in the wheelchair, something in his expression adjusted, not obviously, but in the way that a very careful face makes very small corrections. The nurse positioned me at the head of the table and left. Reed sat to my right. The room had a window facing the building's interior courtyard, flat December light, a pair of small trees in a planting bed below, a water pitcher on the table. The standard furniture of a room arranged to look like a reasonable setting for an unreasonable purpose. Pemberton introduced himself by name and by firm in the precise cadence that attorneys use when they are establishing a record. He said he was pleased I had recovered sufficiently to meet. He expressed the party's gratitude for the hospital's accommodation. He said the matter was straightforward in its terms, and he hoped it could be concluded efficiently. Fletcher said nothing. He watched me. Pemberton opened the folder. The purchase agreement for the Pendleton property was inside 10 acres in Temecula Valley, $50 million in favor of Pacific Meridian Ventures. 3 pages clean, print signature line blank at the bottom of the final page. He began to walk me through the terms with the practiced ease of someone who has explained documents like this a great many times. I listened. I let him finish. Then he slid the document across the table toward me. I picked it up and read it. Not with the searching slowness of someone working through gauze, not the way I had performed it for the same man 4 days earlier in a hospital room upstairs. I read it the way I read everything, with the specific care of someone who understands what he is reading and wants to be certain he has understood it correctly before he acts. First page, second, third. I set it face up on the table. I looked at Fletcher Morrow. I said no. The word occupied the room without needing to raise itself. 1 syllable precise, unhurried, and followed by nothing additional because nothing additional was required. Pemberton started to speak about the terms. I did not look at him. I kept my eyes on Fletcher, and I watched the moment arrive in his face, the specific recalibration of a man who has just registered that the room he walked into is not the room he prepared for. The door opened. Margaret Dunn came in from the corridor and took the chair at the opposite end of the table. She placed a document in front of her, the certified copy of Harold Pendleton's will bearing the Riverside County Recorder's filing stamp from December 3rd. Beside it, she placed a letter on firm letterhead formally objecting to any property transaction not reviewed by counsel of record. She said she was Margaret Dunn, counsel of record, for Harlan A. Pendleton, in all matters pertaining to the Temecula Valley estate. She said the current meeting had not received the consent of the property owner's legal representative. She said no instrument executed in this room would be recognized as valid by her office. Pemberton set his pen down. Reed opened the folder and began placing documents on the table's surface one at a time without commentary. The forged deposit agreement alongside Carlos Vega's written comparison of the signature, the toxicology reports, blood panel hair analysis, the laboratory documentation from the estate samples, the certified transcript of the court-authorized recording of December 3rd, the financial account documentation tracing the Cayman Islands transfers to Pacific Meridian Ventures, the corporate records establishing the beneficial ownership structure. Each document landed on the table with the quiet finality of something that has been prepared carefully and does not require a supporting argument. Pemberton looked at each one as it appeared. His expression moved through several stages and came to rest somewhere that was not composure and not its opposite. The door opened a second time. Detective Ray Farrell came in. Two officers positioned themselves near the exit. Farrell placed his credentials on the table, identified himself by name and division, and said he had a warrant for the arrest of Fletcher Wayne Morrow on charges including elder abuse causing great bodily injury under California Penal Code Section 368, assault with force, likely to produce great bodily injury under Section 245, forgery under Section 470, and financial elder abuse under the Elder Abuse and Dependent Adult Civil Protection Act. Fletcher did not stand immediately. He looked at me across the length of the table with an expression I had not seen on him before, not the composure he had maintained at every dinner and every negotiation and every moment on that staircase. Something beneath all of that. I did not try to name it. Pemberton said quietly that he was invoking attorney-client privilege and would make no statements. He gathered his materials, stood, and walked out of the room without speaking to or looking at Fletcher. One of Farrell's officers moved to Fletcher's side of the table. The formal language of Miranda rights was read in the measured tone required by law. Fletcher stood. His hands cooperated with the procedure. The door closed behind them. I was told later that morning that Constance had been in the main waiting area on the ground floor, while the conference room was concluding what it needed to conclude. Two of Farrell's officers had gone to her there. She had not come upstairs. The conference room was quiet. Margaret was making notes at her end of the table. Reed sat beside me without speaking, which was the right thing to do. I did not feel what I had prepared myself to feel, some version of resolution or release. What I felt was older than that and harder to name. The specific weight of having finally seen clearly a thing that had been obscured for longer than I had understood. Not just the 9 days in this hospital. Further back. Years back. I looked at the certified copy of Harold's will on the table in front of Margaret. 61 years in a storage barn. He had known that good faith where land is concerned is not something you are entitled to assume. He had been right about that, as it turned out. I asked Reed to take me back to the room. He did. The room was the same room. The water pitcher had been refilled and the linen reset while I was in the conference room. The afternoon light through the west-facing window had moved to its late December position, that particular angle in Southern California, where the sun sits lower than you expect and casts everything at a flatter degree than it deserves. I had been gone for less than 2 hours. The room had continued without me, which rooms do. I lay in the bed without speaking to anyone for a while. Reed had gone to call Margaret and to eat something. Dr. Carmichael came by at 2:30 for the afternoon review. She said my thallium levels had improved to the point where the primary neurological risk was considered resolved. She said the rib fractures were progressing on schedule. She said I could be discharged within 48 hours, subject to outpatient follow-up and standard monitoring. I thanked her. She left. Another hour of quiet. Farrell arrived at 4. He closed the door and sat in the chair and went through what he knew in the organized manner he had used from the beginning. Constance had been brought to the Riverside County Sheriff's Office that morning after his officers spoke with her in the hospital's ground floor waiting area. She had waived her right to immediate counsel and given a voluntary statement. He summarized its relevant points. Her account was this: Fletcher had approached her approximately 8 months ago. He had told her that a transaction involving the Pendleton property was viable, that the proceeds would be substantial, and that the obstacle was Harlan's unwillingness to engage. He had proposed a secondary component framed to her, she said, not as poisoning, but as what he described as a pharmaceutical aid, something that would make Harlan more receptive to conversation. She said she had believed it was a mild compound, something that induced drowsiness and reduced resistance. She said she had not known the substance was thallium sulfate. She had not known that it accumulated in the nervous system over months, or that it caused hair loss, or that it could become irreversible. She had thought in the terms she used with the officers that she was administering something closer to a sleep-inducing supplement. Farrell read this from his notes and then looked at me. I did not ask him whether he believed her. He did not offer his view. What I sat with in this hour after Farrell left was the question I could not resolve. 38 years. The woman who had set a glass of warm liquid beside my coffee every morning for 6 months. The woman who had written to her friend in the spring that she did not want to die with nothing of her own. Whether she had known precisely what she was doing, or whether Fletcher had constructed for her a version of the plan that let her carry out her part without fully understanding the mechanism, I did not know. I was not sure I would ever know. The messages she and Fletcher had exchanged did not settle the question. Neither of them had named the substance directly in writing, which was either deliberate concealment or coincidental, and I had no reliable way to determine which. The law would work through what it could prove. What it could prove and what was true were not always the same set. The grief that came with that uncertainty was a different species from the other kinds I had accumulated in 9 days. The other griefs had objects, the staircase, the bottles, the forged signature, the Cayman account. This one did not. It existed in the space between what I had believed about a person and what was now uncertain about them, and it had no clear boundary. Farrell had also told me about Claudia. She had arrived at the hospital on Friday afternoon alone. She had come through the main entrance, crossed the lobby, and reached the elevator. The doors had opened. An officer Farrell had positioned on the ground floor had watched her stand in front of the open elevator for approximately 2 minutes. Then she had stepped back. The doors had closed without her in them. She had walked out through the entrance. This was the second time she had come within a short distance and turned back. The first had been in a parking lot at night, through car windows in the dark. The second was in a building lobby on a Friday afternoon elevator, open 3rd floor accessible. Closer each time and still not able to do what she came to do. I did not know what she came to do. Both times I had been unable to ask. Glenn Whitaker arrived Saturday morning at 10 o'clock in the corduroy jacket he wore whenever the occasion was not formal enough for the suit he reserved for funerals. He brought 2 coffees from a place in Wildemar he had located during the week and a newspaper folded to the crossword section, which he set on the tray table without explanation. He sat in the chair and drank his coffee, and we talked about things that were not the case. He asked about the oak trees on the eastern edge of the Pendleton property, whether the November dry spell had put any stress on the older stand. I told him I thought they would be fine, that oaks in that part of the valley had been through worse droughts than this one. He said he had driven out that way in October the previous year and thought the property was in better shape than when he had first seen it, when Harlan's father was still alive. I told him that was probably the result of the irrigation improvements we had done in 2019. We talked like this for approximately 40 minutes. At some point, without transitioning from anything in particular, Glenn said, "I've known you 51 years. I want to say one thing, and I want you to know it's the only thing I'm going to say about any of it." He looked at me across the room with the directness that had always been the feature of his friendship I valued most. "You handled everything right. From the beginning to the end of it. All of it." I thanked him. He nodded and went back to the crossword. Reed came at noon with the discharge paperwork Dr. Carmichael had authorized that morning. He set the folder on the tray table and sat in the chair Glenn had vacated. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. He placed the folded letter on the tray table between us. My name in my own handwriting on the outside. The letter I had written on the night of December 5th against the possibility of something going wrong the next morning. I looked at it for a moment. "You can keep it," I said. He looked at the letter for a moment. Then he picked it up and put it back in his jacket pocket. "When can we go home?" I asked. "The car is downstairs," he said. "Whenever you are ready." I looked out the window at the parking lot below, the same amber lamps, the same strip of December sky between the building's roofline and the distant hills. I had watched this view for 9 days from a hospital bed. In a few minutes, it would become a view I was leaving, which would be exactly the right thing. "Give me 10 minutes, I said. The estate looked smaller from the car than I remembered it. That is not unusual. 10 days away from a place will shrink it in memory, and then the place returns itself to its actual dimensions when you arrive, and there is a moment of adjustment between the two versions. The house was stone and timber, the same as it had been when Harold built the main structure in 1958, and added to it in the decades following as the property required. It sat on a gentle rise at the head of the driveway, the eastern barn at the property's edge, the stand of oaks behind that. Reed parked and helped me out of the car. The front door was unlocked. He had gone in ahead of me to check the rooms. I came through the doorway and stood in the entry hall and let the house re-establish itself around me. It had the particular quiet of a space that has been waiting, not empty the furniture and photographs and accumulated objects of 40 years still in their places, but a specific presence missing from it, which is not the same as emptiness and has its own quality of silence that you learn to recognize when you have lived with someone for a long time. I did not stop at anything. I walked through the living room, through the hallway, into the kitchen. The kitchen occupied the back of the house and faced the garden. It was where Constance had spent the majority of her mornings. The counters were clean. The dishes were in their places. On the small shelf above the coffee machine, her handwritten shopping list from the week before Thanksgiving was still propped against the coffee jar, all items unchecked. She had been planning to shop the week after. She had not been given the occasion, and then she had not had the freedom. I looked at the cabinet above the refrigerator. Reed had taken the 2 amber bottles in late November. The cabinet was otherwise unchanged, the remaining supplements and household medications still arranged on the shelves, unaltered by what had stood among them. I opened it. The spaces where the bottles had been were the same dimension as every other space on that shelf. The absence had no particular shape. I closed the cabinet. Reed put the kettle on. I sat at the kitchen table and looked out at the garden while the water heated. The rose bushes along the eastern fence had not been trimmed in 10 days, and the late-season growth was showing. Not neglected, unattended. Eugene Taft's work was still visible in the prepared beds and the cleared paths, which had been real labor, regardless of why he had been present to perform it. He had turned the soil correctly and treated the plants correctly, and the garden did not know his reasons for being there. It had simply grown where it was given the conditions to grow, which is what gardens do. After coffee, I went outside. The December air in the inland valley was cold in the way it is at that time of year, not the cold that announces itself dramatically, but the dry, still cold that settles in overnight and lingers past 8 in the morning before the sun addresses it. I walked to the barn. The padlock was the same padlock. I let myself in. The interior smelled of dry wood and old air, and the particular accumulation of tools and survey maps and fencing materials that had been occupying this space for several decades of practical use. On the shelving units my father had built along the eastern wall, on the second shelf from the top was the gap where the brown envelope had rested for 61 years. I stood in front of that space for a few minutes. Harold had known something about people and land that I had not fully internalized, even after inheriting both. He had known that good faith is not a condition you can assume in the people who want what you have. He had prepared for that knowledge carefully and in writing, and had chosen not to advertise his preparation to anyone. I had inherited his property. I had not, it turned out, inherited enough of his wariness to go with it. That was something I intended to think about differently going forward. I locked the barn and walked back toward the house. Reed brought a second cup of coffee to the porch and set it on the rail without a word. We sat in the chairs that faced east and watched the property while the morning light worked its way across the ground toward us. On Monday morning, Margaret called. Fletcher had been arraigned and remanded without bail. Graham Pemberton had formally withdrawn as counsel. Constance had been arraigned, separately released on her own recognizance with standard conditions, including no contact with me and no travel outside Riverside County. Claudia's attorney had initiated formal negotiations with the district attorney's office regarding a cooperation arrangement in exchange for reduced charges. The Pacific Meridian Ventures purchase agreement was formally void. The Pendleton property remained in the name of its owner of record. I thanked Margaret and put the phone down. The oaks on the eastern edge of the property were exactly where they had always been. The January preliminary hearing lasted 2 days. Margaret Dunn attended both sessions. I followed from the estate by telephone. She called at the end of each afternoon and went through what had occurred with the same organized precision she had maintained throughout. The judge heard the evidence the state had assembled, considered whether it met the threshold required for the matter to proceed to trial, and determined on the second afternoon that it did. Fletcher Morrow would stand trial in the Superior Court of Riverside County on charges including elder abuse causing great bodily injury, assault with force likely to produce great bodily injury, forgery, and financial elder abuse with intent to deprive an elder of his property through fraud. He did not stand trial. His attorney contacted the district attorney's office in late January to discuss the terms of a negotiated plea. The discussions lasted 11 days. Fletcher entered his plea on February 14th, a date that carried no particular significance in the case, and which I mention only because Margaret mentioned it, and because calendar coincidences of that kind carry the specific irony of things you would not have chosen yourself. He pled to 2 counts, elder abuse causing great bodily injury, and assault with force likely to produce great bodily injury. The forgery and financial elder abuse charges were dismissed as part of the agreement. The combined sentence was 12 years in the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, with standard credit for time served and statutory eligibility for behavioral credits. The minimum time before parole consideration would be reduced from that figure by a meaningful fraction. Fletcher Morrow was 53 years old. I sat with the number 12 for a while after Margaret told me. 12 years means different things depending on where in a life a person receives it. I had wanted what the law could provide. I had not wanted more than that. Both of those things were true simultaneously, and I let them remain so without resolving them into something simpler. Constance's cooperation agreement had been formalized in January. She had provided complete testimony against Fletcher, corroborating the recorded conversation from December 3rd, and supplying details only a person present throughout the planning could have furnished. Her account that she had understood the compound to be a sedative rather than a systemic neurotoxin was accepted as the evidentiary basis for a reduced charge. She entered a plea to a single count of elder financial abuse and received 3 years of formal probation, with conditions including restitution to the estate, no contact with me or any member of my immediate family, and mandatory counseling. She did not go to prison. Whether what she had told the district attorney was precisely true remained as unresolvable as it had been in December. The law had accepted it because it could not disprove it. I had made a preliminary peace with that condition, which is not the same as a complete one. Claudia's cooperation agreement was finalized in late February. She provided comprehensive documentation of the Pacific Meridian Ventures financial structure and the wire transfer records. In exchange, she received 5 years of formal probation, a lifetime prohibition on serving as a trustee or financial agent for any elder in California, and the ordered forfeiture of the full Cayman Islands balance, $300,000, returned as direct restitution to the Pendleton estate. She had also, at some point between December and February, attempted to reach Reed. He had not responded. I did not offer guidance about what he should do with it. That decision was entirely his. Eugene Taft's private investigator license was suspended for 24 months, following a formal administrative review. No criminal charges were brought against him directly. I could not produce a clean feeling about Eugene Taft. Understanding why a person did something and forgiving them for doing it are not the same operation. I did not pursue resolution of that question. Some things are not improved by being forced to a conclusion. In the last week of March, I drove to Farrell's office with Reed. Farrell said the case had been more involved than most things that came to his desk, a factual observation from a man who had developed a preference for accuracy over pleasantry. I thanked him. He said he had done what the position required. We shook hands. Reed drove us back to the estate. The property in late March was in the early stages of what spring does to the inland valleys. The barn was padlocked. The oaks had not changed. I stood on the porch for a few minutes before going inside. The work of the law was finished. What remained was everything else. The valley in June is a different country from what it is in December. The heat arrives by 9 in the morning and does not leave until after dark. Not the fierce sealed heat of the desert interior, but the dry, pressing heat of the inland valleys, the kind that makes everything in the landscape go still in the middle of the day and then come back to life in the early evenings when the air moves again from the west. The oaks hold their color through the summer, their leaves a hard, dark green that does not give up much light. The garden produces at a rate that requires attention 3 or 4 times a week if you want to stay ahead of it. By June, I was attending to most of it myself. The ribs had been medically cleared in February. The follow-up blood work in April confirmed that my thallium levels had declined to within normal range, a finding Dr. Carmichael called satisfactory, and I called something for which I did not yet have the right word. She noted no evidence of lasting peripheral neurological damage which she attributed to the early start of treatment. I thanked her for being specific about what the early start had prevented. I was 68 years old and in reasonable health. That was the accurate summary. Tommy Greer still came on Thursdays and Saturdays. He was 17 now and had developed a position on the correct height of the lawn along the eastern fence line that differed from mine by approximately 1/4 of an inch. I had decided to let him be right about it. He had earned his standing on this property in a way that had nothing to do with the lawn. The woman who assisted with the garden on Tuesdays and Fridays had come recommended by Glenn Whitaker. Her name was Patricia. Before she set foot on the estate the first time, I had asked Margaret's office to check every piece of professional documentation that existed about who she was. Not because I had reasonable cause for suspicion, because I had decided that I would not again take a man's silence for his character or a woman's warmth for her intentions. Patricia had excellent references, a clean professional record, and a strong opinion about pruning rose canes in early summer that turned out to be correct. Reed came on weekends. By May and June, the rhythm had settled to most weekends, which was appropriate for 2 people who had been through something together and needed to find the ordinary distance again. He would arrive Friday evenings and leave Sunday nights. The 2 days in between had the quality of time not organized toward a purpose, but organized toward a relationship which is different and in some ways requires more attention. In April, Claudia had written a letter. She had given it to Reed to forward, which was her way of allowing Reed to decide whether it reached me at all. He had sent it on unopened. I had read it once, placed it on the desk in the study, given it a week, and then put it in the desk drawer. I had not replied. Whether I would was not something I had resolved. I held those facts without pressing them toward a shape they had not yet taken on their own. Glenn came by in late June with a flat of tomato seedlings he said he had grown from seed and had too many of. He stayed the afternoon. We sat on the east porch in the late heat and drank iced tea while the shadows from the oaks moved in a slow arc across the ground. After a while, Glenn said, "You look better." I told him I felt better. He said, "Not just from the hospital." I let that sit for a moment. "No," I said, "not just from the hospital." He nodded and did not add to it, which was exactly right. In the evenings, I had developed a habit of walking the eastern portion of the property before the light dropped, a 20-minute circuit from the back of the house, along the fence line, past the barn, through the open acreage and back. The walk a man makes to know his land rather than to travel between points. Harold had made the same walk nearly every evening of his adult life on this property. I had started in March, and by June it had become something I did not plan and did not miss. The land persists. It had been persisting since before Harold purchased it in 1951, and it would persist beyond whoever follows me in the chain of this title. What happened around it in the last year of my 68th year was not nothing. But it was not something the land registered as remarkable. It had accommodated everything, and would continue without particular acknowledgement of any of it. The land does not register what happens around it as victory or defeat. It registers seasons. What I had spent the past year treating as the most important question I had ever faced was to the 10 acres behind this house simply another year of weather. I was beginning to find that thought useful rather than diminishing. It was taking longer than I would have liked, which was probably the correct pace for it. September arrives in the Inland Valley differently than you expect it to. The summer does not leave with ceremony. It loosens its hold incrementally. The mornings cool by a degree or two in the first week of the month. The evenings regain something of the quality they had in April, and the light comes in at a slightly different angle without announcing that it has done so. If you are not paying close attention, you might look out a window one morning in mid-September and find that the particular grip of the summer heat has quietly released itself while you were occupied with something else, and that the season has already begun to be what follows summer without having said a word about it. I had been paying close attention all year. Reed left after breakfast on the Sunday of the 2nd September weekend. I walked him to the car in the way that becomes habitual between a father and a son who have relearned a particular rhythm. He put his bag in the trunk, and I noticed he was wearing the jacket from December, the one with the inside pocket, and I thought briefly about what might still be in that pocket, and then let the thought pass where it needed to pass. He said he would be back the following weekend if nothing interfered. I told him nothing was going to interfere. He drove the length of the driveway and reached the road and turned, and I watched until the car was gone. I made the morning walk that morning for the first time. I had been making the circuit in the evenings since March. This was different. The September light comes from the east, at an angle that hits the oaks at a particular degree, and makes them look for about 20 minutes the way very old things look, when the light finds them exactly right, solid and specific, and without apology for being exactly where they are. At the eastern boundary I stopped and took account of what I knew. I knew that Reed had been at the bottom of the stairs, and in the hospital corridor, and in the parking lot on a cold November morning, and had not at any point required being asked. I knew that Constance was meeting the terms of her probation arrangement, and that I had provisionally accepted I might never know the full interior of what she had understood herself to be doing across those 6 months of mornings. I knew that Claudia's letter remained in the desk drawer, and that the drawer would be opened when it was ready to be opened, not before. I knew that the law had done what the law is able to do. That is not the full measure of justice, and it is not nothing, and the distinction between those two things is something a person must settle on their own terms. What I was still learning was what Harold had understood that I had not. Not that the land is indifferent. Land is not indifferent. It responds to everything done to it, and carries the record of everything done around it. But that it operates on a longer measure of time than any single year of events can encompass. The largest year of my adult life had moved through this property, and the land had continued at its own pace without requiring the events to be explained to it or the outcomes to be justified. Harold had walked this eastern boundary every evening of his adult life on this property. I believed he had known this the entire time. I was learning it now. I was 68 years old, standing at the edge of what was mine, and it was not too late for that to be true. I turned back toward the house. The fence line along the eastern section needed attention before the season changed much further. Reed would be back next weekend. Patricia came on Tuesday. The garden was producing the last of the summer tomatoes, which Glenn would take half of if offered, and possibly all of them if not watched. The land was behind me, and beside me, and in front of me, as I walked, not as something you observe from a distance, but as something you move through when it is yours, and you have decided it is worth the defending, and have finally understood what your grandfather was trying to say when he placed a document in a barn and trusted that someone would know what to do with it when the time came. I walked back through the September morning. I had nowhere else I needed to be. My name is Harlan Pendleton, 68 years old. And it took nearly a year being poisoned, pushed down a staircase, and betrayed by the people I trusted most to learn something I should have understood far earlier. God does not protect what you value. He gives you the clarity to protect it yourself if you are paying attention. Don't be like me. Don't mistake someone's silence for loyalty. Don't wait until you are lying at the bottom of your own staircase before you look up and see who is actually standing with you. Elder abuse, family betrayal, and land fraud are not stories that only happen in movies. They happen wherever there is money, trust placed in the wrong hands, and a person too comfortable to stay watchful. My honest opinion, what truly protects you is never the asset itself. It is the one person who shows up without being asked. If this story reached you in any way, leave a comment below, share it with someone you think needs to hear it, and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. It means more than you know. Thank you for staying until the end. Note: stories on this channel contain selective fictional elements created purely for entertainment and to reflect real social issues. If this content isn't right for you, you are completely free to step away and find something that suits you better. No judgment here.